Hey, everybody. On today's Locked On Bama, we're going to welcome in John Garcia of SI.com and the Locked On family. He is our recruiting expert, and he's going to talk about all things Alabama football recruiting. So be sure to stay with us here on Locked On Bama.
Locked On Bama, your daily podcast on the Alabama Crimson Tide. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back into Locked On Bama. Luke Robinson, that's me. Jimmy Stein, that's normally him, but not today. We're going to pretty the show up with John Garcia. John, how you doing?
Doing well, Luke. Just trying to track the best, man. Spring ball's here for high school, so hitting some visits or some practices, I should say. So it's a nice time of year for us.
Yeah, let's jump right into it. I don't even want to get into the preambles about how you're the best in the business because everybody knows that. They've watched this program. So let's go ahead and jump into it. One guy that has been on Alabama's radar, he's on several people's radar, is Troy Bowles. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Bowles.
It's Bowles, yeah. But with an E in there, so it kind of messes you up just a little bit. So Troy Bowles, the son of Todd Bowles, right, who is NFL, not quite a legend, but he's in the NFL, and he's been in the NFL, and he's coaching in the NFL, is he not?
Yeah, he just got named the head coach of the Bucs, so he's coaching Tom Brady now, and he's known for defense, though. So obviously, a guy who's going to foster that into his kids. He's got one at Rutgers right now, but really, Troy Bowles is kind of the crown jewel of the Bowles clan, and he's probably the number one linebacker in the country for us at Sports Illustrated, and he just got that Alabama offer while visiting Tuscaloosa. Nick Saban offered him personally, and he admitted, he's like, hey, Nick is hard to read, but it was really cool to get my first, in-person experience with Saban. And that's important. Any memorable notch is important in this Bowles recruitment because he's a national guy. Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson, Florida, Oklahoma. I mean, everybody wants a piece of this kid. He's trying to get up to Michigan State. So it's going to be a lot of impressions for Troy Bowles. So if you can stand out in any certain way, it's going to help you there in the end. So Alabama's absolutely in the middle of this thing.
I know just by reading different message boards that Auburn has certainly been in the mix for him for quite some time too. Do you feel like there is a favorite, and do you think maybe Auburn has the upper hand in his recruitment right now?
Well, he said Auburn was the childhood dream school, which was surprising, because he's a kid who's now in Florida, and he's moved all over the country because his dad has been an NFL coach his entire life, basically. So he's used to moving around, so you don't get attached to any one college team. But he said that Cam Newton Auburn team, that magical run they went on in 2010, it really kind of caught his attention and kind of introduced him to college football. So Auburn always had an affinity there. He did visit campus for the first time and liked what he saw. And the linebackers coach there at Auburn, Christian Robinson, was at Florida prior. So naturally, he had been recruiting Bowles already to the Gators at that point. So you put those two factors together, and Auburn is kind of the dark horse in this whole thing. It's very high-profile blue blood. I think really Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, probably the three that I would put the best bet on right now. But if there's a dark horse outside of that group, it could be Auburn at this point, which is obviously unusual so far in this class of 2023 relative to the Blue Bloods and Auburn.
Yeah, interesting. It's so funny, and I don't want to get off topic here, though, but when you talk about players getting paid and the NIL stuff nowadays, some people debate if they're really worth it. But, how do you quantify what Cam Newton was worth to Auburn? Now, I mean, somebody would joke and say $200,000. I'm not going to do that. But I think that, it's the same way with Nick Saban in Alabama. Alabama will be living off of Nick Saban's name long after he retires, just like they lived off Bear Bryant's name long after he retired. But, how much is a guy like a Cam Newton worth when he was only there 1 year. He was only there probably 8 months.
Right.
And, but he resonated so much through the college football world. How much is Johnny Manziel worth to Texas A&M? Kyler Murray to Oklahoma? It's so when people talk about players' worth, it's not just for that particular season, because when a guy like Troy sees Cam Newton in 2010, which is 12 years ago, so he would have been 6 years old. You're beginning
Right.
to love football. So, I mean, it was a great timing for him. And so they may even be reaping benefits of guys like him 12 years later, because in their formative years, they started following football. It's just interesting to me.
Yeah, fascinating. And you look, Cam was there, like you said, less than a calendar year, but did just about everything he could have done, right? They won the Natty, he won the Heisman, and then he went first overall in the draft right after. So, yeah, kind of the trifecta for him, as good a 1 year run as really anybody could have. So, yeah, it certainly resonates with kids more than a decade down the line, which is something that you don't really anticipate, even covering recruiting. You don't hear that very often. But again, you think of that family, the Bowles family, obviously football is ingrained in every element of what they do. So naturally, a kid like that is going to latch on a little bit sooner than the typical kid. So Auburn was just kind of at the right place at the right time. And now it's come full circle with him getting on campus. So what a steal that would be for the Tigers if they could upset basically all the blue bloods for Troy Bowles. I don't envision it, but they're absolutely in the conversation.
John, I want to tell everybody now about BetOnline. BetOnline, and you can see now, John, I have figured out how to put a BetOnline picture up
There
while
you
I'm
go.
talking. I feel like an absolute genius. BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball, NBA playoffs, and the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to eSports and more. Head to the website today, or you can use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and actions. BetOnline is where the game starts. Man, I'm so thrilled with myself that I figured out how to do that. I mean, it's so simple, but I'm not tech savvy. But as we always joke, I am a lot more compared to Jimmy. I am Bill Gates. I mean, literally, I am.
So that's the pecking order, right? Bill Gates,
Oh,
Luke, then Jimmy. Got it.
that's it. Yeah. Well, I mean, you didn't even use your hand far enough down for Jimmy. I mean, you would have to burrow into the ground. He literally helps no way when it comes to the technical side of this. He's a genius. He's an Alabama internet legend, yet he knows nothing about the internet. That is very odd. I mean, it's almost like being a fantastic basketball player, 7'4", with a mean crossover in a country that doesn't play basketball.
Beautiful analogy there.
Let me ask you about Jahlil Hurley. This is a guy in Florence, Alabama. A really good player, committed to Alabama, 5-star guy by most circles. He's been visiting Auburn a lot lately. A lot of chatter about his eventual flip to Auburn. You heard anything about this?
Yeah, I got a phone call about it yesterday as kind of a tip, like, hey, keep an eye on this thing. And that could go many different ways. But look, Hurley was a frequent visitor of Auburn in the fall. And it has now continued after the Alabama commitment, something that surely Nick Saban and company are aware of. And I think with the type of prospect he is, his stature, that's going to keep both schools pedal to the metal on Hurley. Bama in the case of maintaining that verbal commitment and leading to a signature, and Auburn, of course, trying to flip what would be the headlining recruit to this point from its Iron Bowl rival. So you kind of understand both sides. He has developed a strong relationship with Zach Etheridge, who is the Auburn secondary coach, who is a really strong recruiter individually as well. So that makes a lot of sense. So I think we just got to keep tracking this thing going forward. I anticipate him getting back to Bama before any major decisions are made. So who knows when that may be? Typically we don't see flips this early in the cycle with a kid who committed 2 months ago at this point. So it would be relatively odd, particularly with an in-state kid flipping from Alabama to Auburn before the season begins. It's just not something we see very typically, but obviously very curious to see where Hurley takes visits going forward. Will he camp down in Auburn? Will he get back to Alabama before any major decisions are made? I think that remains to be seen. But Alabama, if we're aware and talking about it, Alabama's obviously aware and efforting to try to slow things down. But there is legitimate chatter about Hurley at this point, and I don't know the timeline or how serious it is. But the fact that we're getting it just a couple months after the commitment is typically a red flag, or if you will.
Alabama just recently had their spring game. Eli Holstein was there, but there's still a lot of chatter about Arch Manning and where he's going to end up. I mean, I'm not going to have you on this show weekly and not bring up Arch Manning, Eli Holstein, because
Understood.
those two are probably the biggest names when it comes to Alabama circles, arguably the biggest names when it comes to recruiting circles, period. So what's the latest on these two cats?
Yeah, Arch Manning, I was actually able to finally meet him in person on Monday. And yeah, there's just a lot of bubble wrap around his entire recruitment, both from an information standpoint and an access standpoint. Todd Monken was there, the Georgia offensive coordinator, when I was there. But every other school is signing up to spend time there at Newman, including Alabama. We all know Nick Saban has personally been recruiting Arch. Bill O'Brien has spent a lot of time around the Newman facility as well. So I do think that Alabama is still right in the middle of this recruitment. And I got a call late last week, actually over the weekend, that indicated Bama could be in front for Arch Manning at this point. There was a lot of talk after some other outlets put predictions in for Texas. It made a lot of phone calls cycle through the metaverse and to find out, hey, how legitimate is this Texas smoke with Arch Manning? And while the Longhorns are in it, I was told that some people at Alabama have doubled down on the confidence of landing a guy like Arch Manning. So I do think Alabama's right in the thick of it. I do believe Texas is the primary threat. I do see Georgia as kind of a falling number 3 in this race at this moment, but the entire Arch Manning recruitment has been up and down, left and right. It's been all over the place. There's still no timeline for a decision. They're going to let all these coaches come by Newman High School to get a little bit more time with Arch, and he could take more visits before a decision is to be made. Remember, he has taken 0 official visits, so we could still actually have a long way to go in this recruitment. And that obviously reflects on Eli Holstein, right? I mean, there is a simple question for Nick Saban. Will you take a verbal commitment from somebody not named Arch Manning until Arch Manning makes a decision? You know, how do you weigh that? Can you hold off until Arch is ready when there is no clear timeline for when that may go down? So it puts Eli Holstein in a jam quite a bit, but other schools understand that, and they're starting to come after to try to close the gap that Alabama has clearly created with Holstein taking 3 visits this spring. Florida, LSU, Texas A&M's trying to get him back on the commitment list. We've heard Ohio State getting involved with Eli. So it's becoming a bigger battle because everyone's got an eye on Bama, like usual, when it comes to college football recruiting. So Nick Saban's going to have that final call. How do you weigh taking a quarterback versus waiting on maybe the better one, or maybe the one you see as the better quarterback? It's fascinating to navigate. We rarely see teams take 2 quarterbacks that are high profile. I don't think Bama's in position to do so this cycle. So it's going to be one or the other, in my opinion, both from Louisiana, ironically enough, where having been there this past weekend, they still talk about Alabama coming in and just plucking elite talent. So now one of the premier quarterbacks is likely to end up at Alabama this cycle, and it will sting that much more if it's Arch Manning for folks over there. And I think Nick knows that, and that's part of the reason why I do believe the ball is in Arch's court by proxy of Nick Saban waiting on him.
Yeah, I mean, Nick sort of likes, sticking it in their ribs a little bit. I don't think there's any doubt. That's sort of a Bill Belichickian type thing too. John, we're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, I got a couple of questions I want to ask you about the NFL draft. All right, buddy. NFL draft, as people watch this, will be tonight starting.
Okay.
Who was of all the guys you've scouted, maybe name 2 or 3 that when you saw him, even in high school, you're like, okay, that dude's going to be like a top 2 or 3 draft pick, no doubt. I would bet my career on it. Name some guys that jump to mind. They don't necessarily even have to have been at Alabama, but some of them may have been.
Well, Evan Neal was certainly one of those guys. Devontae Smith, I thought was one of those guys that, the first time I saw him live, he was in New Orleans against elite competition everywhere, and he cut up every DB that lined up in front of him. He outran most of them, but then he had this polish underneath to work them as a route runner that made you say, I don't care how skinny he is, this is a guy. With Evan Neal, he was just so darn big, right? We all saw him when he moved to IMG Academy after his first year of high school, 400 pounds. You're like, if they can figure out the weight situation, this kid's going to be a road grader with tackle upside down the line. And about 12 months later, he was already trimmed down at IMG and starting to put things together, working with that great coaching staff and some of the performance guys that ended up at Alabama, at Matt Ray and those guys. So you saw a quick transformation with Neal, where it wasn't just this big SUV of a prospect, but a guy who was very functional, who could really move around. And I'm happy to see him, really do everything in his power to be a top 10 pick and to be that first or maybe second offensive lineman off the board. So sometimes you just know there's really undeniable talent out there. Trevor Lawrence, first time we saw him throw as a sophomore, I was like, I get it. I totally understand all this hoopla that is around him. Najee Harris, certainly as an underclassman, was sold to me as a guy that has a chance to be the number one recruit eventually and then be a first rounder. Obviously, that came to fruition. It's just usually the guys who make everyone else look small or slow on the opposing team. Derrick Henry certainly did that as well. Bama's picked up a lot of these guys over the years, obviously, but for a lot of them, you could tell as 15 and 16-year-olds, which is just crazy in this day and age.
I want to ask you about it is a non-Alabama, but relates to Alabama. I saw the other day Arkansas got a big commitment from a quarterback, right? Is Sam Pittman really beginning to make some waves in the recruiting front? And this does relate to Alabama in the sense that, Arkansas has been one of those games you just sort of chalk up to, okay, it's sort of a semi-off week. They've been a couple of close games. Last year was moderately close for a while. And then there was a 14-13 game back in 2015, 14, something like that, 2014. But otherwise, it's just like an easy win for Alabama and, frankly, for most of the SEC. But, of course, last year they picked up the pace a little bit, and now it looks like they're beginning to get some dudes.
Yeah, I love what Sam Pittman's doing. It's one of those schools where everybody who takes a visit to Arkansas kind of falls in love with it. And Arkansas is contending for kids that are a bit above their weight class, per se, in recruiting, and even outside of the footprint. Typically, when you're talking about Arkansas, the footprint goes into Texas, obviously into Louisiana, the home state. They'll go into the Midlands a little bit, maybe as far east as a Mississippi, but that's kind of their recruiting base there. But now with Sam Pittman, all his ties to really the entire SEC footprint, we're seeing Arkansas dip way further east. They're getting into Florida. And the quarterback you'd mentioned that they just picked up is Malachi Singleton from the Atlanta area. So they're going further into that SEC footprint and contending for big-time recruits. I just had an international recruit, Lucas Simmons, tell me that Arkansas might get his last official visit, and they weren't even on the radar a couple of weeks ago, at least publicly. So they're doing a good job, particularly with certain positions. And obviously, with Sam Pittman, offensive line background, you expect that group to be good. But I think Kendall Briles combining with him as the OC has created a coveted offer in the Arkansas Razorbacks, and they may end up taking two quarterbacks this cycle. So they got a good one to start with Malachi Singleton, who's one of the better dual threats in this class and fits that kind of tough run first profile that Arkansas has been putting out under Pittman.
I don't think I've ever been more wrong about what I thought a coach would be. Sam Pittman has completely changed my attitude about him. When he did all that yes sir stuff at the beginning, I was like, they hired Georgia's offensive line coach, and that's his catchphrase is yes sir. I was like, this is going to be a disaster. And he's actually been amazing. I really have the same feel about him that I did when I watched Mike Dubos's first press conference, and his shirt wasn't tucked in and his hair was all aflutter. And I was like, okay, we may have dropped the ball on this one. But and we did. But Sam Pittman, man, he's doing some stuff. I I recognize his efforts, and I'm thinking it's going to be fun. And the SEC is just always going to be getting better and better. So, John, thanks so much for joining us again this week. I know you squeezed me in, and I appreciate that. If y'all don't know, John is part of the Locked On family now, and we have like a schedule we try to follow where we let John know. And I just said, man, I need you to hook me up. And so he did, and because he's a great American. John, thanks so much for joining us today, bud. How does everybody get to see your stuff?
Always a pleasure, Luke. Yeah, real quick, si.com/college or on social media at SI All-American on all platforms.
All right, buddy. We will catch you again soon. And until that, everybody, roll tide.